Uh, Hello. I am Shreyas, and I'm here with Ambassador Vijay Gokhale today. Ambassador Gokhale is a retired diplomat, a China hand who worked in the Ministry of External Affairs for 39 years. In order, he has served as High Commissioner to Malaysia, as Ambassador to Germany, as Ambassador to China, before finally retiring after having served as a Foreign Secretary of India. Currently, he's a non-resident senior fellow at Carnegie, India, and since his retirement has been extremely prolific, churning out 3 books and numerous working papers and reports. And today I have the privilege of discussing his book, After Tiananmen, The Rise of China, for my newsletter, the Indialog. So thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Shreyas. Delighted to be on your show.
Sir, I will delve into your book. You did public service for nearly 4 decades as a diplomat, and this is a different form of public service where your aim is to inform Indians about China. So the first question, why did you decide to write a book about China about this particular period from 92 to 2012?
Shreyas, in my 40 years in the working for the government, I came to the realization that although China is a neighbor and a significant rising power, the vast majority of Indians did not have adequate sources of knowledge about China that were written from an Indian perspective. So, therefore, we were forced to read Western perspectives on China. And while these are very well researched, they are not necessarily fully aligned to Indian interests or Indian requirements. For that reason, I felt that we must have a greater body of literature on China written by Indians for Indians. And what really spurred me on was that the public debate we have about China in India is either very prejudicial or very sensational. And it is episodic. Every time an incident occurs, there is a lot of audiovisual material and print material on China, but it is never an analytical process. It is always just random facts and an immediate interpretation of what is happening on the ground or what is happening on a particular issue. And this is what spurred me to write the 2 books on China, namely Tiananmen Square, The Making of a Protest, and the more recent one, After Tiananmen, The Rise of China. So essentially, I cover in my first book the phase from 1980 until 1989 when the Tiananmen incident occurred. And I try to explain the internal dynamics in China, political, economic, and why this fundamental change took place in that decade of the 80s, and also what led to the Tiananmen incident. The second book, I think, is much more important and relevant for Indians because this was the period, 1990 to 2010, when China really rose. And it is extremely important for Indians to understand why China rose and how it rose. Because there are very simplistic explanations that people give about China's rise. And it is not as simple as it seems. After all, we too are a big country, a diverse country, a developing country. We know how difficult it is to ensure that the economy grows at double digits.
Yeah.
And yet China could do that for 30 straight years. There had to be some lessons that we could learn. And I thought it was important that I write about the lessons, both positive and negative, by the way, just so that the Indian public had an Indian perspective to this.
Sir, on the lessons, I think one of the key takeaways, especially in your first chapter, is that none of this is predetermined. There were a lot of political headwinds that Chinese leaders themselves are facing. There was also a period when internal sort of dissent was allowed within the top ranks of the Chinese Communist Party, where there were sort of arguments about what route should be taken and what shouldn't be taken, especially when it came to how do you facilitate economic growth through land reforms and through sort of the reforms that you take towards state-owned enterprises. So on this particular aspect, especially on the conflict between those who advocated for certain capitalist market-based reforms versus those who are against it, especially those on the left, what lessons can India as a democratic society draw, given that we also have debates about what shape economic reform should take? And what is your sense on that, sir?
So you're absolutely correct that nothing is predetermined in China. And in fact, one of the objectives in writing the book was to explain to our people in India the extent to which Deng Xiaoping and a group around him took political risks in order to bring about reform. There was plenty of opposition to them because there was vested interest in keeping the system backward. And Deng took a great political risk in doing those reforms, especially after the Tiananmen incident, when the logical thing to have done would be to hunker down and to actually tighten controls of the system. So I think the first lesson that we need to take away from this is not to presume that because China is a dictatorship or an authoritarian system, that the political leadership does not therefore have to take any risks, or that the risk is much less than leaders in democratic societies like India take when they undertake fundamental reform. The second lesson, I think, which was also a thread through the book, was that when these risks were taken, they were taken in a very calculated manner. In other words, if you wanted to reform a part of the system, you also put in place the alternatives so that overall social instability did not happen. Dissent would happen, but it would not lead to a social collapse, a collapse of social stability. And therefore, when the communist state began to dismantle, for instance, the huge welfare schemes that the Communist Party had put into place for 40 years, it did ensure that there were alternatives in terms of cheaper or subsidized housing instead of free housing, some sort of a social security net in place of permanent employment, and so on and so forth, which would mitigate the worst impact of a fundamental reform of the economic system. So there are many lessons we have to take away from this period, because this was really the period when China not only grew very fast, but basically outstripped India.
Yes, sir.
And for that reason, if we don't understand what China did during that period, we can neither understand why we did not move as quickly as China, nor can we understand today's China, because today's China is very different from the China between 1990 and 2010.
Yes. So one of the key points that comes across is sort of the facilitation of economic growth that both Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao sort of pursued. The second aspect that they really worked on was how do you prepare China to behave like a major power? And for that, it is a lot about how you present yourself, the language that you couch your rise in, if you call it peaceful rise versus peaceful development, and how you present yourselves and the spaces that you fill in strategic spaces, especially when powers like the United States sort of withdraw or pull away from Southeast Asia, as you demonstrate. Keeping those lessons in mind, we are today in sort of a different geopolitical environment where there is a recognition that China's rise may have not necessarily benign consequences for those in the region. But given how China sort of couched itself during those terms and how it rose, what lessons can we draw today?
Well, there were really two reasons why China showed such spectacular growth between 1990 and 2010. And it is extremely important to understand these two reasons. The first is more easily understandable, and that is power was no longer centralized within one man like Mao Zedong, or even a group of people like the Politburo Standing Committee under Deng Xiaoping. The power flowed out of the center to the provinces. And the provinces were encouraged, as decentralization took place, the provinces were encouraged to experiment and innovate and find different means of improving their economic situation within, of course, the strict confines of the political system, which is run by the Communist Party. But within that political system, they had a certain degree of economic freedom, a freedom to make economic decisions which would be good for the state and good for growth. Mm-hmm. The second reason, however, which is less evident but equally important, was a general relaxation of controls that the party exercised on the people across the board, not just in terms of ideology, but in terms of innovation, in terms of freedom of thought, in terms of freedom of speech and expression, in terms of freedom of human contact. And the result was an explosion of ideas, of innovation, of research and development, of science and technology. And in fact, it was during this period that the foundations of what is today a strong science and technology regime in China was laid. Huge amounts of money went into upgrading the education, both primary and secondary, as well as tertiary education. Significant amounts went towards research and development, both on the civilian side and on the military side. There was a much greater freedom for scientists and intellectuals to contact their Western counterparts and to seek information and to exchange information. And there was even much greater freedom in terms of religious practice, actually. Mm-hmm. So that decentralization of political and economic power, combined with the relative relaxation of authoritarian control, is what actually led to an enormous growth in creativity, as well as in terms of innovation, and it is this that powered the Chinese economy. Mm-hmm. And I'm pointing these two things out because I think that after the current leader took office in 2013, on both these issues, there has been backtracking. Now, I do touch upon why this may have happened in my last chapter of that book.
Yes.
But this is the fundamental difference, I believe, between the Xi Jinping era, if I may call it that, and the pre-Xi Jinping era. That is the clamping down on decentralization of power and the clamping down on that relaxation which was given in terms of societal and intellectual freedom. And therefore, there is a very new China that we are dealing with today, which is not the China of 1990 to 2010.
Yes, sir. Sir, alluding back to when the first question where you said that a lot of commentary on China is superficial in a sense and episodic, and every time there's, say, a border clash or something, there's some analysis on that. But sir, by putting India-China relations in a historical framework, you actually say that 2005 was arguably the last high point in India-China relations in a sense. I have two related questions on that. The first is, as you make very clear in the book, the thorniest issue in India-China relations is the border issue. Every sort of proposal to work out this issue, to figure out dialogue, actually emerged from the Indian side. In 1993, there was an agreement. In 96, there was an agreement. In 2005, there was an agreement. Even when, say, the Indian government was going through these processes, there was a realization that the border issue was not given the same sort of importance on the Chinese side, or basically what was the Indian perspective when the proposal was being made, that this is an issue that we need to figure out?
Yeah, Shreyas, it's more than just the border. I think we must understand the dynamics of India-China relations from the perspective that the two countries had of the other country. If you look at Indian foreign policy right from 1947 till date, the broad understanding is that China is a major Asian power. It is a power which is there to stay, which is likely to shape the order, the political and economic order in Asia, and it is therefore a country with which we need to maintain a relationship, and which we need to partner if possible, or at least with whom we need to reach an accommodation if India is also to rise in the 21st century. Therefore, the point I'm making is we gave a central position to China in our foreign policy. Not the central position, but a central position. In the case of China, it was very different. And we have realized this only over time. So far as China was concerned, it considered itself the victor of the Second World War. It felt it was the Asian power which had defeated Japan. Now, whether this is factually correct or not is not relevant. This is the perception and this is the myth that the Communist Party has created. And from this flowed the belief that therefore they need to shape the Asian order as the principal power, and others, including India, Japan, and so on, might have secondary positions in that process, but that China would be the principal power. Now, from this also flowed the view that as the principal power, China was equal in status only to the United States and the Soviet Union, and that India held a subsidiary position. So, whereas we viewed China as a central power, the Chinese viewed India as a subsidiary power. And the result was we were therefore viewed not as in the context of our own capabilities and intentions, but in the context of the triangular balance of power between the Soviet Union, the United States, and the People's Republic of China. And therefore, we were seen in terms of either positive or negative, depending on which relationships we had with the other two major powers. If we swung too close to any of them, whether it was the Soviet Union in the 70s or the United States in the 50s or the United States today, the Chinese considered India to be a problem or a threat. If we remained relatively balanced, as was the case in the 1980s or the 1990s, the Chinese considered us not relevant to their foreign policy because we didn't represent a threat. And therefore, there was no effort to engage us in the same bilateral framework that we were intent on engaging the Chinese. Now, within this, whether it was the boundary dispute, whether it was the trade dispute, whether it was our membership of the nuclear suppliers group, or whether it was the listing of terrorists, there was no change in the Chinese approach because it was always seen within the triangular balance of power framework. And there was no change in our approach either because we always felt, well, China is an important country. We need them to get to understand our concerns and we need to get them to accept them. So I think it is really, I would say, the Galwan incident, which has brought about a fundamental rethink in India. And if you look at the intellectual and academic output post-Galwan, you will see that even the staunchest, the academics who staunchly felt that despite all our problems with China, we must make efforts to try and improve relations even unilaterally, have all now begun to say that we are dealing with a different China and that on that basis we need to develop a whole different set of diplomatic, strategic, economic and other tools to deal with them. So there is a fundamental shift in thinking that has occurred.
Sir, taking this logic forward of how China views India in comparison to sort of the other great powers, one can easily make the argument that today India and US ties have strengthened deeply and will likely continue to do so for reasons that have to do with what the United States wants, but also for India's own rise. Given that this will be the case, and this may likely be the most probable long-term trend, what does then this mean for India-China ties, keeping sort of the same logic in mind?
Yeah, well, that's of course a very hypothetical question. But
yes, sir.
The point you have flagged is important. Have the Chinese also drawn lessons from Galwan? I have no doubt that they have. The question is, which lessons have they drawn? Have they drawn the lesson that you have just pointed out, which is that India is a rising power because of its own innate economic, political, and diplomatic capabilities, as well as because of its partnerships with other countries, and therefore we need to deal differently with India? Or has it drawn the lesson that India is moving far too close to the United States, which is our existential threat, and therefore we need to not only maintain the current policy, but harden it? Now, in this will lie the answer to the future of India-China relations.
Yes.
But my own view is that the 2020s will be a decade of uncertainty for this relationship, because the answers to these questions will not crystallize that quickly.
Yeah.
If you look at Chinese statecraft and strategy, they tend to take a prolonged period of time testing the adversary or the opposition multiple times before they come to a point where a shift takes place in the relationship. Until that happens, I have therefore postulated in my papers that we will move from a state of peaceful coexistence to a state of armed coexistence. And it is in this state of armed coexistence that we will have to live for the next 10 years. Now, I hasten to add that I am not suggesting that armed coexistence is tantamount to conflict.
Yeah.
It is simply tantamount to a situation where significantly enhanced military presence on both sides of the land border, as well as growing military competition in the Indian Ocean and in the Indo-Pacific in general, will be the nature of the beast, as it were, going forward.
Yeah.
And there will be periods of higher and lower tension depending on the extent to which the Chinese attempt gray zone tactics, gray zone warfare tactics, either along the line of actual control or on the high seas in the Bay of Bengal and the Arabian Sea by sending ships to probe us, whether they are hydrographic vessels or they are intelligence gathering vessels. But I do believe, in fact, that the two countries have fairly mature leaderships. Both realize that it is not in the interest of either to have a conflict with the other. Therefore, I believe we will be able to manage it. My one concern is that there is always the possibility of a mishap when you are in armed coexistence. Yeah. So the real test will be whether in this decade of uncertainty, both of us can evolve a risk management system which will avoid even the small chance of a mishap. Yeah. And this situation has become urgent because what happened in Galwan should tell us that the existing framework for risk management is imperfect and did not work.
Yeah.
Or at least it did not work in that instance.
Yeah. Sir, on this question of one of the core issues between India and China being the issue of perceptions, how the other country perceives the other in both its relationship, bilateral relationship, but also in the international order. As you said, that it is not in either country's interest to be locked in conflict. But given that the issue is of perception, what is it that Indian leadership or Indian diplomats can do to ensure that India's point about what it aims to do, and especially what it wants its relationship with China to be like, is put forth in a manner that is perceived the way it is intended, as opposed to how China puts its prism in this perception?
Yes, I think, that process has already begun, I suspect. I think the Chinese, perhaps when the current government took over in 2014, had forgotten that we had coalition governments in India after 1989. And that therefore, they had never really, this generation of Chinese leaders, the post-Deng generation, had never really dealt with a single party government. And as you know, a single party government has a greater maneuverability and greater freedom of action than a coalition government. So I think first they misread the current government in India, assuming that it would, like earlier governments, have to make compromises on all policy, foreign and domestic. And that they had therefore a greater scope to influence different constituent members so that they could keep Indian policy relatively constrained. They are now dealing with a government which doesn't depend on any other political party and therefore has a greater freedom of action. So to one extent, I think the existence of this government for 10 years would have brought about a certain realization within China that you deal differently with a single majority government as compared to a coalition government. Secondly, I think they are beginning to gradually realize that India is redefining the whole concept of strategic risk and strategic patience. Whether it is the Uri strike or the Balakot strike, or even what happened at the end of August 2020 at Resinla and Rechingla on the Kailash range in response to the Galwan Valley incident, are all small indicators that the government is less risk-averse and more willing to take risks than perhaps earlier governments were. I'm not passing judgment on earlier governments because, after all, risk capabilities depend on our economic, military, and other assets as well. But there is no doubt that the current government has demonstrated a greater appetite to take risk. And the Chinese perhaps also are beginning to realize that. I think it is also probably gradually sinking into the Chinese mind that their expectation that India and the United States had far too many differences between them, both ideological as well as in terms of interests, such as Pakistan or Afghanistan and so on, to ever become strategic partners, has been an incorrect assumption, because I think they do realize that despite there being no complete identity of interests or values, I point this out in the recent speech I gave at the Center for Advanced Study of India. Despite there being no identity of either values or interests in any complete sense, there is a great congruence in both interests and values. And for that purpose, the two countries, the United States and India, are willing to put aside whatever differences they may have, both in interests and in values, in order to forge a greater strategic partnership. So in a sense, so long as India continues to hold steady on its course, and I think that is what the government is doing, we will be able to shape and change China's mind. But as I said, we are not going to, this is not a linear process. They will try to use all sorts of tactics, including gray zone warfare tactics, or what is these days called military operations other than war, in an effort to test you, in an effort to see the extent to which you are able to stand up or your partners are able to support you. And therefore, I characterize the 2020s as the decade of uncertainty, because it is not just the Chinese which are developing a new realization of the situation in the Indo-Pacific. We too are sort of crossing the river, as Deng Xiaoping said, by feeling the stones. One step at a time, building relations not only with the United States, but with Australia and Japan, with South Korea, a new look west policy, which is building relations with the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the UAE, a greater interest in the maritime domain, leading to the Prime Minister's vision of security and growth for all in the region. Better relations with countries like Madagascar and Comoros and Seychelles, which never figured on the Indian radar for the last 70 years. This is all part of that approach.
So one of the most interesting things that I found in your book was these meetings that you dubbed talk shops, where it was the issue of China engaging the Europeans on human rights issues, or China engaging its Southeast Asian counterparts on what should conduct be like in the South China Sea. Do you worry that India might be sort of getting pulled into similar talk shops where there is a show of dialogue and supposed addressal of primary concerns, but actually the intention is just to engage without actually deliver on any processes? And I'm asking this question keeping in mind we just had the 14th meeting of the working mechanism for consultation and coordination, which apparently did not yield the kind of results that one would hope for.
Well, the Chinese strategy has always been to engage the adversary. And by adversary, again, I don't mean in any inimical way, but an adversary, the opposite party, in discussions, while continuing to implement their strategy without any change. So, at least to my mind, the fundamental difference between Western thinking and Chinese thinking lies here. The West makes a clear divide between war and peace. The Chinese see war and peace as one continuum. So the world is never fully at peace and never continuously at war. It's always in a state between war and peace. And therefore, the two can continue at the same time. And therefore, they can talk peace, but they can also use certain methods which are not tantamount to conflict, but which are gray zone warfare tactics or military operations other than war. And that is a classic situation we are now seeing on the India-China boundary. So they are engaging in talks. We have had 14 rounds. At the same time, there is enough anecdotal evidence based on media reports, because that is what I read, both domestic and international, to suggest that they have not abated their infrastructure activity, their military deployments, etc., on the line of actual control. They continue to strengthen it even while they continue to engage us. And perhaps they are engaging us until that point of time where they feel they will have a superior position. What I think has changed is that India is doing precisely the same thing. We too then have decided that if this is their game plan, it can be used by us as well. So what you see is very enhanced effort by India to build infrastructure along the line of actual control in a manner that I do not recall having seen for the last 30 odd years, as well as a greater political willingness to maintain high levels of military alertness on the boundary. And, you know, given the fact that we are dealing with a mean height of 3,000 meters to 4,000 meters above mean sea level, this involves a human cost, a material cost, a financial cost, and a political cost. So clearly, the government of India does not appear to be risk averse in such a situation. And therefore, I think we should not be concerned. I don't think the government is deeply concerned about the lack of progress. It would like to see it. But I think we are playing the long game, which, as you know, is the title of my second book.
Yes, sir.
We are finally playing the long game, and I think that's the right game to play.
Sir, I'm going to close off with just two last questions. So the first is, one of the most interesting things that came from your book, After Tiananmen, was the scope of dialogue that was actually possible within the CCP. There was criticism of official government lines, whether it comes to sort of economic reforms or the level of securitization that should be seen in the South China Sea. One thing that has been noticeable in the current sort of Chinese administration has been the centralization of power. So you were in China at that time. Do you think there have been effects, and what kind of effects has that had on the hold that the party has over sort of the state? Because one of the things that you mentioned in your book was sort of the fear of how brittle the party might be. We did see protests after COVID, right, which were not sort of foreseen. And even though sort of they were stamped down on, the fact that they occurred itself showed some signs of what control might look like and how it might sort of dissipate. That is one question. And so the last question was, for people who are interested in learning more about China, obviously they should read your 3 books and your many working papers and reports. But what else can people like me or anyone else who's interested in learning more about China, what should we be doing?
Yeah, well, the first question is very interesting, Shreyas, because ultimately, you know, we must not believe in the myths that the Communist Party is spreading. We must understand the history of the Communist Party. In the century that it has existed, there has never been a leader so dominant that they have been able to completely dismiss all dissent or opposition, however strong it is. Mao Zedong, who was unquestionably the perhaps the most dominant leader China ever had, continually faced challenges to his power. And the Cultural Revolution, which devastated China in the 60s, was largely because of the threat that he thought he faced from his compatriots and his colleagues. Deng himself, despite appointing 2 general secretaries of the party as his successors, had to sacrifice both of them. And it was only the third, and the third was not necessarily Deng's nominee. The point I'm making is, we should not therefore imagine that because Xi Jinping has centralized power, that he is unchallenged within the system. We are not able very often to see that there might be dissent, that may be opposition. That opposition may be underground for the time being, it may be fragmented, but I have no doubt that it is there. And the signs are clear. When you continue to conduct purges of the military as well as in various segments of the party, 10 years after you have seized power, when in fact the appointments that you have made both on the civilian and military side are yours, then these are tiny indications that your power is not unchallenged. Similarly, when you try to impose your own thought as the national thought in the way that Mao did, again, it is an indication that you fear that other strands of thinking may exist. So the point I'm making is that we need to be much more aware of what is happening inside China. And we need to understand that because President Xi Jinping has cracked down, that dissent may have gone underground, but it may not have entirely disappeared. And it might reappear suddenly at any point of time. And the one incident you mentioned is, I think, very revealing. The catastrophic collapse of COVID policy. Look, this is a state which has invested more in its internal security than its external security. It is a surveillance state. And yet the surveillance state could not judge the mood of its people in November 2022. That tells you something about the brittleness of this state. It also tells you that people can hide their views, their thinking and emotion. And that however much you centralize and crack down, you can never eliminate dissent. I think that's important. Secondly, I think what we need to do as citizens of India is read more informed opinion on China from Indians. And there are a large number of books now written by Indians on various aspects. There are, of course, other colleagues of mine like Mr. Shiv Shankar Menon, the former National Security Advisor, Mr. Shyam Saran, the former Foreign Secretary, who have written on China, and those are outstanding books to read. But a younger generation of scholars are coming up in India who are writing on a range of subjects, from urbanization and demographics in China and its impact on the economy, to the future of Tibet when the 14th Dalai Lama is no more. And in a sense, I think these writings are very relevant because these are writings which are contemporary and from a younger generation which is looking at it from a 40-year perspective, as compared to somebody like me who quite honestly doesn't have a 40-year perspective, right? Because we are not looking 40 years ahead. So I think there's a great amount of writing. My worry is there's very little reading. And that is the tragedy, because we just do not feel this country is important enough for us to know about. And we need as a people collective to learn more and to know more. And I hope that your podcast and similar podcasts start that process in the younger generation, because ultimately all of you have to see a rising India coexisting with a rising China all the way up to 2070 or 2080. And if you don't get that right, if the younger generation in India doesn't get that right, then we will always play second fiddle.
Absolutely. So on the reading note, and I can't urge sort of listeners and viewers to read your 3 books enough. There's also so many working papers and reports, all of them open source, freely accessible on the internet that are present. I'm going to link all of it. But so thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. And I really learned so much from your book. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Shreyas. Thank you.